Oh, a very good afternoon. I can see it's always nice when you come into a Zoom, Dale, and you see some friends sitting there in the audience, because it can be quite an interesting space when we're in this virtual space together. But a super warm welcome to everyone joining us on this what are we, Wednesday afternoon. 4 p.m. if you're on standard time, 5 p.m. here on daylight saving time. And this is our very last live learning session for 2023. Hard to believe that we're 2 days away and we'll be in December. So we've had this wonderful opportunity throughout the year to present professional development series, this live learning series for our educators. I'm just going to admit a few people as I'm sharing this introduction. And our live learning sessions are really an opportunity where we get to talk to amazing people, awesome movers, shakers, thinkers, and doers on all topics to do with building enterprising mindsets in our classrooms and our schools. We'll be here on this live learning session for the next 45 minutes. I've just got another person to admit here. There we go. So about 45 minutes. The session is being recorded and will be available on our website for any staff who have been unable to make it today. So please do share widely. And also for folks on the call today, any questions that do pop up for you on the during the conversation, pop them in the chat. I'll monitor that, and where we can, we'll bring them into the conversation. Before we go on any further, though, I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and here across Australia, we meet on many different lands. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations joining us today. So this live learning session, probably a very appropriately planned one for this time of the year, because we are talking about well-being, the well-being of our people and our communities and our schools. And I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome our guest today. We have David Bott, who is the co-founding director of the Wellbeing Distillery, and Dr Michelle Kearney, principal at Bayview College here in Victoria. Both have extensive experience in wellbeing. However, we'll bring to today's conversations very different perspectives and experiences. David is a leading expert in the field of wellbeing and works with schools not only across Australia, but also internationally. And our second guest, Michelle, is a visionary educational leader with extensive experience in student wellbeing, having supported her wider school community through some particularly tough, challenging times, especially these last couple of years. So enough from me. This is really to hear from our guests. And as I'll reiterate that point, if questions do come up, please do jump into the chat, pop them in there, and we want this to be a really lovely, rich conversation, and for us all to walk away feeling we've got a few extra things in our toolkit, ready to go on the break and come back to lead our schools in 2024. But really, to start off the discussion today, I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Michelle, and just tell us a little bit about who you are, your journey briefly in education, and possibly we always just love to hear what was your own experience of school when you look back on that time. So over to you, Michelle.
I've been in school all my life. Never left. So I'm currently on Wooditch-Marwick country in southwest Victoria, and Portland, if you don't know, is the earliest European settlement in Victoria. So a very rich heritage and a very sad heritage down here as well. And I've been here 12 years, having been born and bred in Melbourne my entire life. I started teaching in 1985, and I haven't stopped. I've had a few weeks of long service leave along the way, but it's been a very long career. And I suppose I think I'm heading towards my twilight of my career at this point in my life. But since the mid-90s, I have been passionate about wellbeing. I had a really pleasant time at school. My teachers were positive and encouraging and challenged me at the right times, and they knew me really, really well. And there was one educator who I ended up having the privilege of working alongside in my second and third year out of Teachers College, who inspired me. So I also had great principals that I worked with early in my career who always put the needs of the staff and the students at the forefront. So I'm unapologetically a leader who finances and supports wellbeing, because only then do we have any chance of success in learning outcomes. And so I've been a leader in the wellbeing space since the mid-1990s. And now as principal, it's still a major focus of my work.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks, Michelle. David, I'd love to hear a little bit about your own journey.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. Lovely to hear some of that story. And you were a very early pioneer trailblazer, so it's awesome. Thank you for all the work you've done over the last 10, 20, 30 years, is it nearly, Michelle? So thank you. My journey's a little similar and different. I have always been passionate about wellbeing, but not passionate about teaching.
Thanks, Sam. It's Katrina Bush here. Since I've had my problem last time with Zoom, I seem to have, when I go into webinars, no sound. So I think it is my computer.
Just going to mute somebody. That's okay. We've got that. All good.
Didn't know if I'd finally gone bonkers.
And no, yeah, you have.
In my head. No.
As long as you don't answer back, David. I think that's the key. You can have voices, just don't start a conversation.
So passionate about wellbeing, but not always passionate about teaching, to be honest. My mum is a career educator, founded her own school, actually, Jen. And so I grew up with a mum who was an English teacher at the time, as I was kind of growing up, and mum would be up at 4 a.m. marking English essays. And when I left school, all I knew is I never want to be a teacher. I don't want anything. This is, they work too hard, don't get paid well enough, and not sleeping enough. It's too stressful. I never want to get involved in that. So I stayed away for about 2 or 3 years until I ended up in Japan. A long story, but I ended up living in Japan, and the only job I could do was teaching English. So I begrudgingly took a job teaching English and instantly fell in love with it, and kind of came back to Australia in my early 20s and completed my teaching qualification. I guess it was in my blood, and then taught in Australia and the UK as well. And then my journey is I was really fascinated about mental health and wellbeing, and so I decided to complete my postgraduate studies as a psychologist, and my vision was really to become an adolescent psych. But having completed my studies in psychology, just as I was about to leave teaching, I kind of got stuck in this intersection of positive psychology and education, which is positive education or wellbeing education. So just kind of the timing was right, and I ended up at Geelong Grammar School, where there was the Institute of Positive Education was created, and I helped lead a team of up to 27 of us at one point there, kind of delivering research and training in wellbeing education and working with governments in Australia and internationally. So my passion is right at that intersection of education and wellbeing, which we kind of now call wellbeing education.
Yeah, amazing. David, can I just push you a little bit further on that? There's such a rich experience. You talk about the positive psychology, that time there, Geelong Grammar, Martin Seligman, and that was what I'm thinking around 2005, 2006. That was really at its kind of peak there of our awareness around positive psychology and how we bring this into our schools. But just for a collective kind of understanding today, when we talk about well-being, how do you define it from the role that you have, or how do you view it?
Yeah, it sounds like an easy question. I think it's evolving. The answer is it's quite complex and it's evolving. And historically, you're right, Jen, sort of early 2000s, we viewed that as the first phase of wellbeing education. And people like Michelle were doing it. We're doing wellbeing education long before this kind of technical science of wellbeing emerged. So schools, even educators older than Michelle, schools have been doing wellbeing as long as schools have been around. And then they had pioneering educators like Michelle who were doing this work in the prior to 2000. But around the year 2000, the birth of positive psychology emerged, which is the science of human happiness, or the science of human flourishing. And so we had this very rigorous scientific approach that was being studied at universities around the world, particularly in the US. And then in 2004, 5, 6, Geelong Grammar School became the first school in the world to adopt this new science and to embed it deeply into the heart of a school. So this was not just teaching SEL concepts. This was not just teaching wellbeing to students. It was fundamentally embedding wellbeing science into the heart of a school. And so at that phase, really, though, wellbeing was about the students. It was fundamentally about mental health and wellbeing of students. It was teaching wellbeing skills to students, which is great and a great start. And still, that is an important part of wellbeing education today. But then the second decade of wellbeing education, which was kind of 2012 to 2022, 2023, there was an emerging shift to kind of whole school strategic systematic approaches to wellbeing education, because it's great to teach kids about wellbeing stuff, but if you don't have a school environment that's nurturing, supporting the community, then it doesn't work. So we had a whole school approach focus, and that was the opportunity we had to work with schools and governments at a kind of system level. But now we also see the third phase, of the third decade, if you like, of wellbeing education, Jen, really being about the educator themselves. And we recognize that it's great to have a curriculum for students and that that's paramount. It's important to have a whole school approach, but actually, unless that educator on the ground that's spending, 1, 2, 3, 6 hours a day with a kid, like I've got my own son's in grade 1, Yarraville West Primary School. He's in front of his teacher for 6 hours 5 or 6 hours every day. And that beautiful sacred space between the educator and a child, that's where wellbeing really occurs. And so we feel the third phase is really about empowering the educator in the classroom. So we kind of have these 3 angles around wellbeing education. It's the curriculum for students, the mental health and wellbeing of the student, the systemic kind of whole school approach, and then the empowering, equipping of the educator themselves as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And with that there, I'm going to hand over to you, Michelle, of your understanding and being on the ground, leading a school, your understanding of wellbeing, and maybe how that's evolved as well over time.
I would love to aspire to flourishing, but if I'm being honest, what I'm aiming for on a day-to-day basis is functional human beings.
Yeah.
Where I'm operating from, it's a smaller country town with very few external services. So what we're trying to do, and again, giving the context, Bayview College exists in Glenelgshire, which has the lowest Year 12 attainment rate in the state still, after a long time. Our school is countercultural to that, but my students and their parents are coming from a place and a mindset where education is not necessarily valued as strongly. And so it's okay to drop out. In fact, I've signed nearly a dozen early exemption forms this year post-COVID of people that are leaving school early to go into the workforce. So what we're aiming for on a day-to-day basis for both students and staff and their parents is that they can function and complete what's required of them in front of each day. We struggle to get students to school. School refusal has really increased in the last probably 5 to 6 years. Then you've got the lesser level, what I'd like to call school avoidance, who are, always late, or mum and dad have a convenient excuse for them not being at school. They're empowered by their parents not to come to school. And then there's the task avoiders, that they come to school, but they don't do a lot of the work. So, we really work on making our school a safe place, as you said, David, a sacred relationship between the educator and the student, where the student feels safe to try the risky business that is learning, because learning does, require some failure. And then when they're in that safe, sacred place where they can learn and challenge themselves and fail to learn, one of my colleagues calls it learning, failing to learn, then they can start to function, achieve their learning outcomes, and then hopefully flourish and thrive. And that's sort of the negative worldview, but that's the reality for probably 20 to 35% of my students.
I wanted to shift the conversation, listening to what Michelle's just talked about there, some of the challenges you're seeing come up in your school. You've talked there about school avoidance or even school refusal there. And we'll move into kind of more the strategies and the solutions. We're just kind of setting the scene a little bit with these first couple of questions. David, working with multiple schools, not only in Australia and but also internationally, what are some of the common challenges you're observing in schools and how that might relate to wellbeing?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Michelle has helped again remind us of how different contexts are and why this field of wellbeing is so complex and huge. And earlier, before the call started, Jen, you were chatting about the concept of kind of you walk into a school and every school's kind of the same. They all kind of feel the same and they're all entirely different. And this is the paradox of wellbeing education, that what Michelle's just explaining is so real and so challenging and such, Michelle is so clearly passionate about supporting these students who are really struggling and in really challenging circumstances. And what I'm about to say doesn't deny any of that, but we are, the word is and we're also working with, in many contexts where there are schools and educators who are absolutely loving their work, where educators are turning up to these schools working with kids who are at the top of, that are fully immersed in their education. They love it, and they've got supportive families back home. And so both contexts are real, and those kids are also benefiting from the emerging science, and they all have their own challenges and their own struggles. So to answer your question, Jen, I think one of the biggest challenges is recognizing that there is no one size fits all approach to wellbeing. It's probably the biggest challenge of all, that what Michelle needs, what her educators need, what her students and community and family needs is so different to what North London Collegiate School in Dubai needs, which is one of the top performing schools in the world, in Dubai, that we're working with. Same sort of stuff, but very, very different context. And so it's probably the biggest challenge of all these, taking the science, I think, digesting it, distilling it down into tactical strategies and stuff that can help people in different contexts. So I think probably that's the biggest challenge that we're facing. And if I could say one more, it would be that, and I'm sure Michelle's experiencing this as well, that I think we're at a kind of an inflection point in the world, perhaps with young people, where what's occurred because of artificial intelligence and social media particularly, and just the changing nature of a child's experience, is the world that we grew up in, that you, Jen, and Michelle, and Dale, and Karen, the world that we grew up in as teenagers is qualitatively different from the world that a teenager is growing up in today. And we can empathize what it must be like to grow up in a TikTok experience, but we actually have no idea the reality of what it is like to be a 13-year-old girl or boy today. And so we're kind of at this point where we've lost the ability, I think, to genuinely understand their experience at a kind of a granular level. So I think one of the biggest challenges is really understanding the lived day-to-day experience of a teenager, in Australia, is probably one of the biggest challenges at the moment, is listening, understanding, empathizing, compassionately responding to that, because it's so hard for us to really understand that.
And I think even just to push even further on that point, possibly as well, that is presenting when you talk about teenagers, but also from a staff perspective, and Michelle, you might talk about this, of we have multiple generations with very different experiences of schooling in our staff workplace. And Michelle, maybe if you've got an opportunity to talk to some of those experiences you've had with the new staff and supporting your younger staff, what have been some of the learnings or initiatives that you've put in place? I'll stop talking and hand that question over to you.
So my staff profile is from a couple of 19-year-old trainees that we've got working with us. I'm not the oldest, I'm close to the oldest, and people in their mid-60s getting ready for retirement. So we're only a small school, but 55 staff, but we've got the full gamut. So one of the things that we really try and focus on is the importance of connection, that there is at least one person for staff and for staff and students who really know you really, really well. And can understand you and can read your body language. So that's something we really do. We set up a mentorship program from the time a new staff member joins us, and we try and pursue that all the way through. And we have small mentor groups for the students as well. So a staff member knows a group of 12 to 15 students intimately. We have maintained our working from home policies that we adopted during the COVID lockdown eras. It worked really well for us during that time, and staff didn't abuse the privilege. And now I've got some staff with young children who really value being able to take their correction home if they're not required to cover a class, and work from home. That has been something that we've kept going. The other thing that we've done really successfully in the last few years is recognise that we are just a mirror of our community. So we have several sector blind initiatives with the 2 local high schools. We piloted the Live for Life program, which was developed in Woodend many years ago, and the Glenelg Shire was the second shire to take that on, which is a mental health first aid program, ideally for year 8s and year 11s, with a whole range of staff trained in mental health first aid. And that's to help prevent youth suicide. So we collaborate with Portland Secondary and Hayward Secondary in that initiative. And then over the last 2 years, in partnership with those 2 schools and also Rotary Say No to Family Violence, we did a massive fundraising campaign and brought Collective Shout down to Portland. And every student in our secondary schools, every staff member in our 3 secondary schools, and a whole range of parents and community members got to experience the learnings from Collective Shout and how the social media and the TikTok generation is impacted by what they're seeing. And so being able to have those sector blind conversations, not just within our own community, but across the community, has really formed connection, help people see the situation that we're all facing for what it is, that it's not just one school situation, we're a reflection of the community we're working in, and created that dialogue that is so important to unpack how you're feeling when you're having a tough day or difficult day, or when a student has confided something quite confronting to you. So I think, you know, what I come back to always, how can we build connection between people for their emotional and social well-being, and how can we empower them and give them a voice?
Amazing.
And one of the big things we did this year for our staff really struggled last year. Coming back from lockdown, that rebuilding connections, not being in silos, dealing with student misbehaviour and disconnection, students in class and then not in class because they had COVID and all that sort of stuff. Last year was a really tough year for our community. So we brought in some scholars in residence from University of South Australia who workshopped with our staff and with our students and a small group of parents, and gained some data on what they were thinking and feeling, what their concerns were. And out of that, our staff developed some mini inquiries, some action research projects, which they took ownership of and developed in response to their concerns and what the students were saying. Our students developed some projects, for example, our Year 8 City School Pride project, where they've actually done simple things like gardening and painting of furniture in the gardens, but it is about working together, collaborating on things that they've decided are really important to them, and again, building this social connectedness.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm just going to give a little bit of background information of our journey together, Michelle, because I do remember a few years ago, our first connection and chat, and jumped on a call with you, and you shared with me about community that had been devastated by bushfires in the area, and you were grappling with that. And then I remember another year goes by and we jump on, and the next call is about working with your community, building their resilience at times of lockdown and through the pandemic. And it's just I do feel a number of our conversations have been punctuated with kind of really tough situations faced by your community, and this real sense of a connection and community has come through in our conversations. And that's why I'm absolutely thrilled that you're able to join us today, because it certainly has been a strong part of your leadership out there in Portland.
Yeah, if we just look at our school, we're not going to achieve anything. Anything, well-being or anything. We have to recognise that our school is part of that unique context. As David said, you know, the context in Dubai is very different. There's some amazing programs and amazing theories out there and amazing research, but it's not always going to work in every setting. And so we walked away from positive psychology because our community was devastated with job losses and redundancies, and the students and parents were feeling hopeless. Positive ed would not have worked for us. So we had to find other more tangible ways of doing it. Pet therapy is fantastic. You know, you bring in some birds and some fish and axolotl and cats and dogs, and they start conversations about what's really going on in their lives. So for us, it's always about looking at outside of our building, beyond our bluestone walls, what is happening in our shire around us, what is happening in the workforce, what is happening for our parents, and then how is that impacting on the young people and our staff, what's happening to their partners in their lives, and then how is that manifesting in the school, and what might we do to stem the tide or help them develop the resilience and the skills to deal with that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. David, I'm going to leverage off a point that Michelle just made and articulated there, that possible programs such as positive psychology no longer held their relevance in response to what was happening in the community. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the programs and initiatives that you've been working with, and possibly even a little bit of what I'm looking at the Wellbeing Distillery? This might be a nice kind of segue into some of the work that you're actually doing.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. I again just want to huge respect for the way Jen kind of is able to articulate her responsiveness to what her community needs, and ultimately that's exactly what this work is about. It's It's about recognizing, as Michelle said, that a school is a community. It's part of the community. It's reflective of the community, and it's literally inside of a community. And so this, we've worked with over 1,000 schools around the world, and I think maybe 200 of the schools we've worked with, this work has failed because that one reason is that there's a disconnect between what some ambitious principal wants to do and the reality of what the community needs. It's almost the sole failure point for this work. And the reverse is true as well. When this work really flies and succeeds and transforms communities is when it connects with what the community really needs, and which is pretty obvious. And that's where, respectfully, I just want to in my head, just reframe a little bit about Michelle's concept about positive education being a program that wouldn't have worked. And I think at its worst, positive education is a program. And sometimes it is marketed as a program. We have never sort of seen it as a program. We see wellbeing education, positive education as an approach that puts wellbeing at the heart of a community. And so a lot of kind of our work is helping people understand what this work really is, because I think sometimes there is misunderstandings. Sometimes the way certain organizations market this work, there is a cottage industry that exists around this wellbeing education stuff. And so there are sometimes narratives that are unhelpful for schools. So when we talk about programs, it's a word that we kind of have a bit of a reaction to, because wellbeing education should never be a program. It should be an approach that addresses the needs of the community and empowers, as Michelle says, empowers and equips the community in response to their needs. So with that said, there are some really helpful kind of ideas and products and tools that schools can access that can be helpful as part of this overall approach about addressing the needs of the community. Our organization, for example, does have online training programs. We do have student middle school wellbeing programs that are built around imagery and artwork and conversations. We do have pretty sophisticated measurement tools that schools can access, but it's not a solution. It's just a tool that a school can use as part of a broader attempt to support what the community needs. So we're quite strong on that, and that's why we kind of have this much broader perspective about what wellbeing education should be about. And so that's why with any school we work with, we start from ground zero, and we speak with the community, we speak with students, we speak with parents and educators and all the different stakeholders, and we try and identify where's your school at and where do you want to move to. And then we kind of reverse engineer the stuff that kind of fits into that point A. We're at point A, we've got to get to point B. How can we most efficiently, effectively get there, and what's available to us? What do we need to co-create inside of the school? What can we bring from outside? And that's kind of our vision for how we make wellbeing education successful.
Amazing. Thank you. There was a point you just said, I'm trying to think how to frame this question, because there was a point you just said there, David, about actually all right, how do we actually even know if we're having impact or success with some of the initiatives in our schools? How do we actually measure it? Like, what are key indicators or metrics that we should be looking for? Maybe either Michelle or David. Maybe I'll start with David and then maybe move across to Michelle and some of the work you might have done around that. Like, how do we know we're on track?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, Michelle, but I think the reality here is, first of all, Jen, let's be real, and that is that it's really hard to measure wellbeing effectively. The best tools we have are pretty crude, if we're honest, and we've been involved in leading the development of multiple types of measurement tools, including $1 million research studies funded by the Australian government that used biometric measurements like saliva sampling, cortisol measurements, and heart rate variability and stuff with the University of Melbourne. So we've been involved in some pretty large, sophisticated developments of metric tools and stuff. And having been involved with that, what we've seen is it's pretty hard to measure wellbeing really effectively. So we acknowledge that, but we also appreciate that even that it's kind of in that crude level, there is some really powerful value in just attempting to measure, or at least seeing shifts, or at least focusing our awareness on attempting to measure, or placing value on measurement is in itself is pretty powerful, because we measure reading and writing because it matters, and we should also be measuring wellbeing because it matters. Like, there is some kind of philosophy around it as well that's pretty important. But So the way we tend to work now is we have this belief around measuring cohorts rather than individual data. Now, there are some tools and metrics that are available that identify individual students, and they're crucial, particularly in settings like where Michelle is, where we need to identify students that are particularly at risk. That sort of data is helpful and important, but we are much more focused on kind of cohort data, where we look at the bigger levers that schools have at a sort of system level. So, for example, if you measure a school and we find that year 11 girls or grade 5 boys have particularly high levels of anxiety, we now have a tool where we work very closely with University of Adelaide, actually, and Resilient Youth Australia to use their tool called Gem Finder, which not only identifies kind of the challenges inside of a school, but the levers or the drivers that are causing that high level of anxiety, for example. And the drivers might be things like friendships at school, or sense of belonging, or sense of connection to their teachers. So we're able to identify the specific drivers that are causing those challenging issues within a school, and then we can manipulate those drivers to increase belonging, which then causes a beneficial impact on anxiety, for example. So we do have these very sophisticated measurement tools now that are getting better. They're still quite crude, but they're getting better. And that kind of data really allows schools to hone in a really specific, targeted way on statistically significant variables that are actionable inside a school that can have large-scale long-term impacts. So the work around measurement is super important. The tools are getting better, but we've still got a long way to go.
Thank you, David. And Michelle, what about just there on the ground, from your perspective, if you look at your community, possibly not tools, but maybe it is, but how do you know, what is it? Like, how do you know something's working on the ground?
We use a crude measurement tool, which is a pulse check, and it's 3 short questions, which we use regularly in the first part of the year, and then at points when we sense that the climate is interesting to say. Being a school community of just under 300 students and 50 odd staff, and having those connections I spoke about before, I've got a couple of key people who know fairly quickly when things are going off kilter. You can't underestimate the power of the receptionist. That first point of contact in the morning. We've got a couple of fantastic educational support officers who know the students, who know the parents, who can tell from an absence message that something might be off. So I rely on absentee data, the reasons why people aren't at school very strongly, and I do rely on my educational support staff quite a lot because they know our community really, really well. The crude data is great because we'll sometimes pick up people that have been flying under the radar, who haven't presented at student services, who aren't seeing our counsellor, who aren't working with a chaplain, who don't get involved in discussions in our wellbeing program. But again, because of the size of our school, and we have so many staff that know our students, not only in school, but outside at the football club and the cricket club and the netball club, we can often track things early. I say that we operate in a fishbowl. We can't hide at our school, Bayview. Everything we do becomes obvious, if not straight away, fairly soon after. Having said that, we're looking at improving what we're doing in that space. We've looked at a few other different tools this year where we're formalising our wellbeing curriculum. We have dedicated time for wellbeing education year 7 through to year 10. We have a very intensive camp program, which is another way that we do our wellbeing. We utilise our outdoors that we can take great advantage of down here. But it's for us, the most powerful data we can get are the conversations we have.
Again, that point of connection, community, knowing your people, it doesn't appear to be rocket science here. It's the same things of actually just, our relationships come first and then we can build from there. So it is, isn't it? Fundamental to all of us. We all want to, if we looked at education as a place that was human-centered first, and a place that for our young people was a place rich of fulfillment, joy and belonging, and for our educators, a place that they felt truly empowered and a sense of autonomy in the work they're doing, then I reckon we're on track. We're on track to building a pretty healthy environment for our people and our communities.
We can track a few school refusers by their attendance on the day that our therapy pets are at school. When our therapy dog's at school, their attendance is much greater than when our dog is not at school. Simple data like that is really powerful.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. David, anything there you'd like to add before I throw another question in the mix?
I think that this word's come up multiple times in this conversation, but belongingness seems to be at the core of pretty much all of our work that we're seeing, and what Michelle's speaking about, what you're noticing, Jen, is that one of the cool things I think for me about COVID was that I personally firsthand saw my son, learn to read and write without going to school, because he was in prep at the time here in Victoria, and Melbourne was the most locked down city in the world at the time. So what I know, because I've seen it, is we don't need schools to teach kids to read and write anymore. You can do it online, and he did it really successfully, and he used Khan Academy and stuff. And so we don't need schools to teach kids to read and write. So what are schools for? And really they are for causing community, like literally kind of catalyzing belongingness. And it's important. At the moment, my little son belongs to our family. He's 8, but in the next 3 or 4 years, he'll have a psychological shift as he develops into moving away from the family, and he will belong at school. That becomes his new kind of home. And that's where the belongingness is, particularly that kind of adolescent age, is so fundamental. If we get it wrong, it's disastrous. If we get it right, it's incredibly empowering for a child. And and belongingness or connection is one of the very few basic psychological needs that a child is not born with. Like, a child in their DNA is born with this incredible resilience and capacity to adapt and thrive in the world. But there's only really 1 or 2 things that a child's not born with, and belongingness is one of them. Like, we need other people around us to enable us to flourish. And so I love what Michelle's speaking about. In fact, I think we're kind of making sure we draw a very clear distinction between belonging and fitting in. And I think schools like Michelle, or principals, heads of school like Michelle, are really sensitive to that concept that it's not just about kids fitting in. That's not enough. They need to feel that they belong. They can be themselves and still feel like they're part of a community, rather than trying to fit into some sort of social setting. And so the concept around belongingness is absolutely fundamental, the fundamental pivot point for all of this work.
Thank you, David. As we move into we're about 10 minutes from finishing this up. I'd love to ask you both, for our audience today, for any classroom educator or leader out there listening to the conversation or watching our presentation, or listening further down the track on the recorded version, what is one kind of tangible, an action or an idea that you could share that they can take back into the classrooms or bring into the classrooms next year, just really to empower every young person or their staff members in their community? What is one that you'd like to share for today? Who's going first out of my... Great, Michelle, it is you.
For school leaders, and this might be controversial for some principals, I actually invest more time and money into my wellbeing leaders than I do into my learning leaders. They have greater time release. I have, as I said, a small staff, but I have a full-time non-teaching counsellor plus a chaplain, and my year level coordinators have double the time release of my learning leaders. Because if our students, I'll go back to the word functioning, if our students can't come to school functioning to do the job that they're required to do while they're at school, then they're not going to learn anything, no matter how great the curriculum is and the program is. So time and money into the right people, into the roles, is absolutely essential. And they have to be prepared to be connectors to community and to fight for the rights of young people. And that means sometimes fighting with the Department of Child Protection and other outside organisations to make certain that those young people are being looked after well enough. And a simple, tangible, like it costs very, very little. We've got budgies, we've got fish, we've got axolotl, we've got a cat, Sebastian, and we've got Rowdy the dog. It doesn't take much to find a staff member who's prepared to train their dog, bring their cat in once or twice a week, go buy some goldfish, put them in the library. That is huge. Those therapy pets that we've got are actually life-changing for a whole bunch of students. And it's a very small investment.
Thank you so much. You've got I've just made some mental notes here. Thank you. David, over to you. Same question.
I think because Michelle kind of answered it from, let me give two kind of a bigger answer and then a smaller response. But again, just listening to Michelle, who's kind of in schools all day, every day, the awareness of different stakeholders, like just having a mental awareness that if you're going to think about well-being or you care about well-being, the only way to do it successfully in our experience is to be really aware of all of the different stakeholders. And that's everyone from the chaplain in Michelle's example through to the, the school leaders, through to the well-being leaders, through the teachers and parents and students. You have to have everybody singing from the same hymn book. We've got to have the same language being used. You've got to have a kind of a multi-stakeholder approach if you're going to really do this successfully. And so I love how Michelle's so aware of that and talks about that so clearly. From a micro perspective, we've seen just at a zero cost intervention is a focus on character strengths. And I know many schools in Victoria, Australia, internationally are using the VIA Character Strengths Profile tool. This is a piece of work that's over 20 years old now. It's a research tool. I think more than 12 million people around the world have been part of this piece of research, but it's a free tool that helps identify kind of in order which positive human qualities are most signature, most kind of inherently energizing for each individual person. So it's a whole kind of framework, a scientific framework around the positive human qualities that exist in all of us. And it's just a very uplifting part of the science. If any educators are interested, they can check out viacharacter.org, where there's free tools for teachers and for students and hundreds of research papers. And so this focus on the positive human qualities that we have, these human tools, is powerfully uplifting, energizing, exciting, and really safe, because some of the work around well-being, education, mental health, resilience, some of it's really challenging and potentially threatening for some teachers to talk about, maybe drug use or, psychosocial risk factors or resilience. Like there's some really difficult stuff. But character strengths is just a focus on the positive human qualities that exist in all of us. So it's uplifting, empowering, and safe. And really, really cool. There's some beautiful things being done by schools around kind of visual representation and conversations around character strengths. So that's where I would start.
Thanks for that. It just reminds me there, David, I did some work with with a boys' school up in New South Wales, and they looked at those character strengths and then were able to use those to weave into a mission statement. So they were looking at building out their CVs and but being able to identify their character strengths and then use that, because they are really, really positive. And then these young men standing up and sharing their strengths with each other. It was a really powerful learning experience and moment. So I love to finish our conversations on a bit of a high note, a bit of a share. And Michelle and David, I'd love for you to share with us something that you're reading, something that you're listening to today that you just go, you know what, audience, you must get your hands on this or go in to listen to this. What is it that you're listening to, reading, engaging with?
Well, Michelle, you got one?
Okay, so something that my team and I use quite frequently, a series of children's books by Kobe Yamada. What do you do with an idea? What do you do with a chance? And what do you do with a problem? And then there's two more, maybe and trying. You can get 1,000 assemblies out of the various concepts in there. They're beautiful little books. They're very, very simple, but they very clearly show how dealing with problems, ideas, and challenges is a challenge. And if you come through it, then you're going to feel really good about yourself. So never underestimate the power of those sorts of books by Kobe Yamada, Dr. Seuss, Beatrix Potter, all of those, Winnie the Pooh. I am very proudly a child fiction book reader, and I use quotes from those books all the time to inspire my staff and my students.
I love that you shared this, Michelle. In a former kind of teaching life, I used to work up at Timbertop, and if anyone's been to Timbertop Geelong Grammar School, they've got this beautiful chapel with a glass frontage. And we used to come into chapel, and one of our educators up there used to take the chapel service and read Winnie the Pooh. And I'd just be like, I'd be first up there, get my seat run in the front pew, because it was just so engaging and inspiring. And out of all of those experiences, that one has stuck with me. This view over the mountains up in the high country, listening to somebody with this beautiful silky voice reading Winnie the Pooh. It was magic, magic.
You're out of Winnie the Pooh.
David, over to you.
I love that recommendation too. Obviously, teachers should be reading my book. No, don't read it. It's not worth reading. But no, my recommendation would be this one here, which is we're recommending this for a couple of schools in Melbourne that we're working with have asked for a recommendation to buy for their staff over the summer. It's quite a thin book, so it's really readable. It's really cool. It's by Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar, who's amazing researcher, thinker, writer, formerly at Harvard. He's an Israeli-American psychologist, brilliant man. And this is called Happiness Studies and Introduction. And it's really Tal writes beautifully about the kind of philosophy, the science, the history of this field of well-being that we're all kind of part of in this world of well-being education. But he is a beautiful writer and super smart. So Happiness Studies and Introduction is an awesome book for educators to read to kind of get a picture of where the field's come from, why it matters, and where it's going.
Fantastic. Thank you. Both of you, I was writing furiously on Post-it notes that are now stuck all over my laptop here. But we will actually send the links in a follow-up email so that we have all of this shared. I'll share information as well around the Wellbeing Distillery in the Humanitics link that you would have clicked on today. There is a link there if you'd like to connect with Michelle and David on LinkedIn, and also include those links in there in the follow-up email. But for everyone, we are right on 5:45, like nailed that. Well done, everyone. Thank you so much for turning up here, especially if you're in Melbourne. It's a very wet, wintry kind of summer's day, almost summer's day, at 5 p.m. here. Thank you so much for making the time. These events as well, David and Michelle, thank you for your generosity. These don't happen without you giving up your time and sharing your thoughts, experiences with us. So truly, truly thankful for you sharing with us on this very last live learning session for Future Anything for 2023. We will be back in 2024. But for everyone on the call, for those in the last few weeks of term 4, have a beautiful rest of your term, and we look forward to seeing you back here next year. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone. Happy summer, everyone. Bye.
Yeah.